Hi, I would like to welcome you and get this symposium on neuroscience and education started. So welcome to those of you here in the audience at AAAS and to those of you watching our webcast online. We have a great lineup of discussions for today, and I hope you're as excited as I am. We've got two fantastic panels and a keynote that I hope you can attend at 1 p.m. If you miss any of these sessions, know that we are recording these, and the recordings will later be available both at the web page where you registered for the symposium and also on the online at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. So I want to tell you, as we go through the day, in the interest of time, we will not give long introductions of the speakers. All of you here today have the bio sheets in front of you, and those of you online, we've posted those where you can find them as well. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into the day. We will, after the first panel, have lunch on our own, and I know that there is a list of restaurants that's just outside on one of the tables. We do invite you to come back to AAAS. We hope that you will come back and talk to others that you meet here and network. But please, no food or drinks in this auditorium. We have other rooms here on the second floor that can be used for lunch. During breaks, if you need to find the restroom, those are located behind the stairs that you came up to come to the second floor here. As I mentioned, we are webcasting, so when we get to the discussion period, we hope that you will use the microphones that are set up here in either aisle. And also, by being here, I should let you know, since we are webcasting, you are giving your implicit agreement, and we are taking photos as well, you're giving your implicit agreement to have your voice and image used. If you do not want your photo taken, please let us know. Let anyone you see with a camera know. So I wanted to thank our sponsors. Many, many, many thanks to the American Association for the Advancement of Science for hosting us here, for sponsoring this symposium series, and also to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, which has co-sponsored and co-planned the event. Many thanks to the Society for Neuroscience, which sponsored the breakfast that we've just enjoyed. And I wanted to say a little bit about our co-organizers. So these events, this series of symposia, and I hope that you've had a chance to check out, at least online, our past symposia. We had one on neuroethics last summer, and we had one just a couple months ago on neuroscience and data sharing, and those can also be found online. But this series has been co-planned by AAAS Neuro Policy Group and Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And for this event, I wanted to give a special thank you to one of the interns at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, Brian Barnett, who is webcasting for us today as well. He's really done the intellectual lifting behind this event, and he's done a fabulous job. Thank you, Brian. So I also wanted to point you to the Neuropolicy events. So there are flyers outside. The Neuropolicy group, it started as a group for AAAS fellows, but it's actually open to anyone. We have an evening discussion series, and I hope that many of you will join us for some of those. We also have a mailing list that you are welcome to sign up for, and we send out information on neuroscience and policy. So this is an important topic, and I'm excited to get the day started. So I'm going to introduce very quickly those who will give a welcome and introductions. First, Dr. Alan Leshner, the Chief Executive Officer of AAAS, Executive Publisher of the journal Science, and a longtime supporter of neuropolicy. And he will be followed by Dr. Philip Rubin, who's the Principal Assistant Director for Science at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, and another longtime supporter of neuropolicy. Thanks to you both. Alan?
So I'm welcomer number one. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we don't, this is AAAS. I used to work in drug abuse, hold your hands, sing Kumbaya, you say good morning, they go, oh, good morning. I'm addicted to it. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, now I feel better. Let me add my welcome, and I actually have a charge for you. I don't want to take too much of your time, but the topic that we're here to talk about today, and unfortunately I'll only be able to stay for part of the morning, but the topic is multifactorially tremendously important. Not only is neuroscience gaining a tremendous amount of interest in this country, but the frustration with what's going on in education and where American education has been is also growing tremendously, and the intersection seems to be an obvious one where there should be insights from neuroscience that are in fact concretely applicable in education. I'd like to tell you a story. So I am, in fact, myself a neuroscientist, and I spent many years at NSF, and then at NIMH, and then at NIDA. But when I was at NSF, one of my innumerable jobs was as one of the staff directors of the first National Science Board Commission on Pre-College Education in Science, Mathematics, and Technology or Engineering, I forget the last word. But it was in 1983. And it was a commission of luminaries, really famous people, including Bill Cosby and people like that. And at the end of it, at the time, Eric Bloch was the director of the National Science Foundation. I went off to go do biological, behavioral, and social sciences. Eric Bloch gets a delegation of unnamed, very famous cognitive scientists. This is 30 years ago. They came to see him. He is an engineer, and a rather famous one. And the purpose of the delegation was, like everybody who goes to visit with directors of agencies, to ask for money. And they said, we in the cognitive science community, we didn't actually have a cognitive neuroscience community then. I was invited because I was the psychology guy. We are poised to ask the right questions, send money. Eric Bloch said, where you been for 30 years? And I thought that was a very telling question. We've been supporting you for 30 years. What have you produced that, in fact, would change the way we do education? We are now 31 years later, and I challenge you to not just have an interesting and provocative conversation today, but rather try to be as concrete as you possibly can about what those literal insights are that are literally applicable to education, so we're not having the conversation with the director of NSF or whoever 30 years from now and they're saying, where you been for 60 years. So with that challenge, the set of panelists is terrific, and so there's no excuse if it doesn't happen. But the speakers among the very best that we could have. The topic is as important as any topic in current science, and certainly in terms of the intersection between science and the rest of society, science and policy, science and education. You can't ask for something more important. So don't mess it up. Thank you. Phil. I get to call up Phil Rubin. I think that's my job. She said who you are.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Philip Rubin, and first of all, I'd like to start by thanking Alan Leshner and the AAAS. It's an amazing organization, and it's been really a supporter of neuropolicy and neuroscience for many, many years, neuropolicy more recently. I'd like to thank also the Potomac Institute, Heather Dean, and the rest of those involved with neuropolicy. I'm going to try to be very brief because we're running a little bit behind schedule and get this thing going. Most of all, though, I want to thank you and anyone listening in remotely to this for coming today. As part of my role at the White House, I lead something called the White House Neuroscience Initiative. It's a very broad initiative that ranges from issues of mental health, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative disease, the Brain Initiative, and a host of other things. One key activity that we do gets very wonky government-wise with acronyms. It's the NSTC, National Science and Technology Council, Interagency Working Group on Neuroscience. over 20 entities meet regularly to consider opportunities in the federal government. One thing I wanted to do was just quickly read you the mission statement of a portion of that. This working group will enhance federal efforts related to improving our fundamental understanding of the nervous system, including brain structure, function, development, and plasticity, improving our understanding of learning and cognition, and applying that to improvements in education and other areas. That's an area that in the second year of this group we're focusing on, so we're delighted that this activity and others that we're aware of are starting to happen, and we're going to try to be as supportive. In general, federal groups like that mostly work behind the scenes. At least one of the people, Liz Albro, who's supposed to be here, is a member of that group. I'd also like to mention that at the end of the day, we expect to have Tom Khalil here. He's our Deputy Director for Technology and Innovation, and he'll be talking to you about the BRAIN Initiative and the President's all-hands-on-deck efforts to try to get further commitments on that. And so you'll hear from him at the end of the day. In closing, though, I would like to mention that at this moment, the President's Bioethics Commission, and the Executive Director of that commission is here today, is releasing a report called Gray Matters, Integrative Approaches for Neuroscience, Ethics, and Society. Integrating ethics explicitly and systematically into the relatively new field of neuroscience allows us to incorporate ethical insights into the scientific process and to consider societal implications of neuroscience research from the start. This report is one of eventually two, so we're very excited to have that happening. We worked with the President's Commission to make sure that in the BRAIN Initiative and other areas of neuroscience, ethics was integrated right from the start. So with that, I hope you have a great meeting. I'm going to stay through the first portion of it, but then unfortunately have to leave at lunchtime. So have a great meeting, and thank you for inviting me.
All right, so we'll jump right into it. As I said, no long introductions, but I'd like to invite up Dr. Jay Geed. He's the Chief of Brain Imaging at the Child Psychiatry Branch at the National Institute of Mental Health, and he will introduce panel one.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning. I'm very honored to be here. It's one of my most passionate topics. I come at this through some convergent pathways. The first and most important is as a parent for students, for teenagers, and kind of seeing their educational experience with different strengths, weaknesses, learning styles, reflecting on my own. It's a bit of frustration about the lack of progress in bringing neuroscience into the classroom. Another path is from my day job of looking at how the brain develops, what influences the brain development for good or ill in health and illness. And originally starting out, we were thinking, what's wrong with the teen brain? What's wrong with these developing brains? Why do all these illnesses occur? But coming away more with the notion of all that is right with the child and teen brain. And this enormous plasticity that is so exciting in terms of if we can just harness a fraction of this potential. So largely in terms of imaging, and I would say the same for genetics, it's been sort of disappointing in terms of we've generated a lot more papers than we have helped people. And in terms of using imaging for diagnosis or affecting everyday clinical care. And so for me, I've failed at that initial effort in terms of really changing clinical practice, but I'm much more optimistic about education, because we don't have to cure education. If we nudge it 1-2%, leverage it across 2 billion K-12 students on the planet, I think it's by far neuroscience's biggest bang for the buck. Because if we and so this is why I'm so passionate about this area. And my third path was a bit more convoluted, was from John Brewer's book on education and neuroscience, A Bridge Too Far. initially did a review of this book, and it's annoyingly good, actually, but he makes the claim that nothing, that we, the exact challenge that Dr. Leshner put out, okay, other than, waving our arms and stuff, specifics. What have you actually changed about teaching or parenting in a neuroscience way? And I thought, oh, this will be easy. Well, this is not going to be a problem, but it's, as you noted, it's not nearly as easy as it seemed. So I'm on the advisory board of the Learning and Brain Conference. I've been to dozens of international conferences and hundreds of domestic on these topics. And brain-based is used in so many of the talk titles, or the prefix neuro, neuromarketing, neuroeducation, neurogaming. It's sort of like one of these buzzwords. So it's along with nano and molecular, apparently. So if you throw those words in, even if they're irrelevant, they kind of add credibility to your statement. This is kind of an aside, but social seems to have the opposite effect. So the word social invalidates whatever follows it. So social science, social worker, social security. So not advocating that point of view, but this notion of just sort of saying brain-based or throwing neuro into the title is so common. And so sitting in the audience of these, and I don't know if I should admit this in public, but as a child I was a big fan of the World Wrestling Federation with the kind of fake wrestlers on TV, and they usually had the good guy and the bad guy, and you could always tell from the introduction if they were very capable, or always tenacious, or tough as a $2 steak, they were going to lose that match. But this notion then of sitting in the audience and hearing these claims about left brain, right brain, 10%, male, female, just sort of cringeworthy overgeneralizations and half-truths, I found myself looking around and being like the fans in the wrestling where the cheater always does something blatantly obvious that everyone in the room can see except the referee. Right? They call it blackjacks, brass knuckles, and 2x4s, Saturday night specials, and everyone's saying, look, he's cheating. That's not fair. And that's what it feels like in terms of this sort of brain-based as a marketing instead of a science term. And so you spelled it out so well in terms of how do we get past the hyperbole and the false claims to really get at the science, the honest science, and to progress. And so one of the speakers this afternoon, Mary Hardiman's book on brain-targeted education, really, for me, revitalized this interest in terms of she really brought together, solid, good science. So I was like, in-your-face, Brewer, kind of this. I thought this was really kind of a breakthrough in terms of a step in the right direction. And so I'm delighted that she's part of this conference. And this idea of bridging the gap between neuroscience and education, to start us off, is appropriately middle named Martha Bridge Dankla, who, if we were back in the World Wrestling Federation, would be the belt wearer in terms of an inspiration to all of us in this field. And so her voice is a little bit weak from allergies, so everyone have to listen intently. But I think of the ideal person to kick off this panel.
I apologize for having very little voice, but luckily I think the amplification will work. And also, I didn't make any PowerPoints, but I have written up my remarks, and I don't know if somebody wants to share these so that if there's any difficulty hearing what I have to say. First of all, I'm an MD. I don't know if I'm the only MD on this panel, but I'm a neurologist, and I've been at this since 1970 approximately, when I was thrust into working on children who can't talk and children who can't read when I went to my first job, just having qualified as a neurologist. Confession, I'm not a child neurologist. I'm a neurologist with a cognitive behavioral training with Dr. Norman Geschwind, whose name might possibly mean something to some people here. And I was simply thrown into going to a clinic at Columbia Presbyterian Neurological Institute and told, you will see every child whose chief complaint is can't talk or can't read. My first publication addressing why can't Johnny read was in 1972 with something called the Rapid Automatized Naming Test, which in conjunction with Marian Wolf and then Lori Cutting, my work now has grandchildren because Marianne would be my daughter and Lori Cutting my granddaughter in terms of the amplification of this research, and there's been enormous use of this. But although this was developed in order to find out whether children were ready to read on a very mechanistic neurological basis, to the best of my knowledge, almost nowhere is it applied. So I would like to quote my friend Frank Vellatino, with whom I've done research in the past. He's a famous professor emeritus at SUNY Albany. And he said, you know, this research has been beautifully funded. And thank you, Brett Miller. Right up until the last time I wanted to even do a research project, I've had wonderful funding. I've built a career, but I see almost no impact of things that have been published since the 70s that have been circulated among professionals, but they have not gotten into education almost at all. Now, why do I say the rapid automatized naming came out of neurology? Well, that which attracted me into neurology in the first place was hearing Norman Geschwin talk about something called pure alexia without agraphia. And following that further to alexia with agraphia, I knew which pathway in the left side of the brain that goes from the back to the front and has to take audio-visual information up to, essentially, to the mouth. The see it, say it circuit was involved, and so I wanted to do something that involved speed because I knew that children would never show glaring total absence of the ability to do something, but that on an age-dependent basis, they would get faster and faster in a way that would support the activity. After all, initial reading is speaking at print. And therefore, the whole idea was, can we get an index by increased speed of the myelination, that is the insulation around the long pathway that allows it to operate as an express train rather than as a sort of stuttering local train. Now, of course, in the last 25 years, I've had the privilege of doing a lot of imaging, and we have some very entertaining imaging that supports the inference that I made that this would be a good marker for myelination. And just as a teaser, I'll tell you that we have a small but very, very carefully done study on children with dyslexia versus typically developing controls, in which indeed the superior longitudinal fasciculus, when you do tract pathway mapping, shows that in the dyslexic children, an inordinate number of fibers get off the express highway and go into the parietal lobe, as though their brains just want to go to meaning and do not wish to just stay on the relatively superficial level of see it, say it, as a phonological support system. But that's years later. I mean, and this has been picked up with rapid automatized naming, thanks to pressure from my junior colleagues, has become commercially available. People in a lot of diagnostic centers use it. Have the implications of this as a marker for readiness of reading been implemented? No, nothing has happened. Okay, the second piece of research in which I participated, again in the 70s. You can't even find these things because they're before they went on Medline. So a lot of my most important contributions are available only through my lineage of people I've trained. But this was developing something called the physical and neurological examination for subtle signs. And this was hitching a ride on something that psychiatrists had been working on before. Unfortunately, they called it soft signs because they didn't realize that you could actually understand what it was based on. So they were trying to look for neurodevelopmental markers. And at first, again, because I'm a neurologist, people gave me research grants to study a disorder. So in this case, we were trying to study hyperactive children. And, before 1980, there was no attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It was simply called hyperactive or hyperkinetic, and it was folded into this weird thing called minimal brain dysfunction, which friends of mine pointed out had the same initials as I do, MBD. But it really was a very sort of global, meaningless thing, sort of saying the brain is involved here. Brain is involved was about all you could infer. But in order to see whether there was some brain is involved here qualities to what we then call hyperactive children, we developed this motor examination with a timed component. The only big innovation I pressed upon the neurological establishment was to use a stopwatch in order to time certain movements. And indeed, we found that certain aspects of the PENS, particularly the one involving what we call inhibitory insufficiency or overflow movements, were highly diagnostic of children who were then called hyperactive. Plus, we found that on the timed motor, they were slow, giving rise to the apparent oxymoron that hyperactive children are slow. In other words, they are in Brownian motion, but when they have to do goal-directed things, they are slow in accomplishing them. Now, the other thing is that within this battery, there was a finger sequencing element. Simply this. I don't need slides to show you. You do time to do 20 movements, which is 4 by 5. And it turns out, for example, that if you look at 5-year-old boys, and I have to bring up boy-girl differences, it's impossible not to, we have different norms, 5% of 5-year-old boys have what I call mitten hands. They cannot make these differentiated movements at all. Then Ginger Berninger on the West Coast picked up my work, and she applied it very broadly to the development of handwriting. And she has very large bodies of very elegant data showing for kindergarten concurrent and for later grades predictive value of whether you are up to speed at doing finger sequencing, much less if you still have a mitten hand when you're 5 years old. So Virginia brought this forward into a very robust readiness measure. So I'm just going to stop at the moment and say, in the service of doing work on disorders, the research has come up with large bodies of normative data, one of which has to do with a brain basis for readiness for reading, another which has to do with readiness for handwriting. Have these made any impression on public education? Quite to the contrary. I'm alarmed that within the past 10 years, and now institutionalized by the Common Core, and I would love an introduction to Arnie Duncan to give him a few lectures, we do not apply readiness concepts to when we begin instruction. We have children who are not wired up yet to do reading, being asked to do reading. We have children who are not wired up yet to do handwriting, who are asked to do handwriting, and you know what they do? They do it with their arm. And I would like to just pause and say, if you know people who are trying to remediate pencil grasp, this is an absolute futile exercise. Pencil grasp is not the problem. Pencil grasp is the outward peripheral manifestation of where the myelinated fibers from the brain are able to make a statement to a set of muscles. And if they can only get as far as the arm, then the arm is doing this scrubby movement, and the pencil is nestled in the web space between the thumb and the forefinger, because there is no signal going to the tips of the fingers where the actual correct pencil use takes place. So pencil grasp is not a problem to be corrected, which is widely not understood in schools at all. If you sense a note of frustration in my somewhat limited voice, this is true, because I see a tremendous crisis. The crisis is that we have decided arbitrarily that kindergarten is first grade. We have decided arbitrarily that everybody is going to do things a year earlier. Now, even leaving aside the fact that the curves for boys and girls at age 5 are very different. In fact, the motor coordination curves for girls who are 5 fits over the motor coordination normative Gaussian curve for boys who are 6. It's an actual full year difference for girls. Then there's intra-gender variability in addition to that. A study done not so long ago showed that if a little boy has a birthday in the summer, he is 4 times as likely as his other boys to be diagnosed with ADHD, because for each grade in school, he is too young. Secondly, if children are given preschool, you may have seen an editorial or an opinion page piece by Swanson and some other experts on ADHD who said that they're seriously concerned about universal preschool, not because it isn't a good idea, but because of what ill-considered things may be done. In other words, we'll push academics without regard to whether the brain is ready to handle them to this very young group, and they won't be able to cope, and they won't be able to go through even the formal characteristics of an academically based program, and then we will say that they have ADHD because we have made premature demands. Third point, very briefly, because I don't have time, the third thing I've been doing research on is executive function development, which means the ability of the control systems in the frontal lobe to cope. And we have done another wonderful prematurization by pushing middle school earlier. There are some places where middle school even starts in 5th grade. Many places it starts in 6th grade. It used to start in 7th grade. Again, we are asking children to manage time, deal with many different teachers, navigate hallways, do all sorts of executive skills, and then they're thrown moral turpitude remarks like, you should be able to take responsibility, and you should be able to do X, Y, and Z. And even when I look at some of the, again, Common Core questions for reading comprehension, they require a level of executive function that is far beyond the grade levels to which these Common Core reading exercises are pitched. So I would like to conclude by saying I see a real crisis. It's getting worse, not better. My grandchildren are having a worse time in public school than my children did. This is because we have ignored completely, and I, as somebody who's done over 40 years of publication on this, feel a great frustration over it. We've ignored all of this, and we've just decided that children are not biological developing human beings with brains that have differences even within ages, but certainly even on average we are ignoring brain development, and we're just pushing, and we are going to get a lot of pushback from children in terms of hating school, being maladjusted to school. We are not going to achieve the results that we desire if we ignore what we already know. Certainly we're going to learn more, but I think we are really possessed of a good deal of knowledge, and it is really frustrating as both a mother and a grandmother, as well as a professional, to see that when I teach classes of teachers, they say, oh, you're talking about these very idealistic classrooms with children being individualized for. And I say, well, I'm very sorry, but my children who are in their 40s had those classrooms. It's their children who do not have them in quite comparable school systems. So I will stop right there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denkla. I actually had the pleasure of working with your son when he was in our lab at the NIH way back, and have used your physical and neurological examination for soft signs over 5,000 times in our studies. So
Jay, please, subtle signs, not soft.
Subtle signs, yeah.
Please. I'm a neurologist. Subtle.
Right. I always just use the acronym. So Laura Anna is next up, and on this sort of theme of building the bridge is the foreman of this, doing amazing work in advocacy on helping us bring in a very pragmatic, real way the neuroscience advances to the classrooms. Thanks. Let me see. Heather, is it? Oh,
So,
I can just open
thank you,
it.
yeah. Yeah, you can help me. Oh. Well, I'll begin by thanking you so much for inviting me. I was very much looking forward to speaking today. I, too, will begin with just a personal journey. I was sitting in my office in the year 2000 at the Montreal Neurological Institute. I was a researcher in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery, working with Brenda Milner, Michael Petrides, and Robert Sartori. We had just received an exciting grant on, as Dr. Leshner said, cognitive neuroscience didn't exist until around the late 80s, early 90s. We had won a McDonald Pew Foundation grant for the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, and had been about 10 years into the studies and was very excited about this. But we also had the frustration that we've heard about this morning. And the frustration was that discoveries were being made and they were being siloed. Basically, oh, my slides aren't advancing. Okay, here we go, got it. Basically, discoveries were being made about the bilingual brain, about the age at which children should be exposed to bilingualism, radical differences when children are exposed to two languages later in life, impact on education, impact on reading, academic performance, and even social integration, all of which were staying in their silos and had very little to do with the educational system around us. In fact, where I was living at the time, it was in the Quebec Ministry of Education. They had set as against the law, being against the law, to expose a child who's in the French-speaking schools to English until grade 4, which flew in the face of biology. We saw immediately that those children, by the time they were age 20, would have different rates of processing, more effortful, greater accents, and in having radical implications for their integration into society. So, for example, when the big banks wanted to make a hire, they were going to take the bilingual person, not the person who was struggling in English or struggling in French. So, in that context, I received a phone call from a dean at Dartmouth College who said, we need you, come down, you have to fix something. And what they wanted fixed was they had a Department of Psychology that was wed earlier to a Department of Education. They were integrated one system, and they were pulled apart. They divided them into two different departments, and the education component was dying. And so they had this idea, rather than close the department, to revolutionize it, do something different. So in 2000, I moved to Dartmouth College and created what I named it to be educational neuroscience, a new discipline. So what I'd like to argue is that the marriage has been done. We're not Brewer's Bridge too far. We're beyond that. I want to strongly say that we have a solid body of knowledge. This came out of the coming out of the Science of Learning Centers at Dartmouth. We were one of the first cohorts in the Science of Learning Center. The center that we created was called the Center for Cognitive and Educational Neuroscience. From that, we built the first undergraduate program in the United States for educational neuroscience, which also trained teachers to be educational neuroscientists. But just to tell you what this discipline is, it is not neuroscience and education. Those are roommates. This instead is a married couple. This is the joint study of how humans learn, particularly learning that's core learning in early child development and early schooling. And it's coheres around 5 domains: how children learn language and bilingualism, reading and literacy, science and biological concepts, math and numeracy, social, emotional, and moral growth. And what is powerfully at work in this discipline is its commitment to cognitive neuroscience methods, its commitment to principled translation of the research findings in meaningful ways that reach and aim to solve core problems in contemporary education, and also it's committed to a two-way discourse between the educational community and the neuroscientists. So this is a field that's alive and well, and is rich and in a poised state to communicate with policymakers In fact, we have no problem talking to parents, no problem communicating to teachers. The greatest gap is our ability in the discipline of cognitive and educational neuroscience to bridge to policymakers. So just to briefly highlight the points, we're talking about taking real educational issues that are real problems for students in contemporary education and identifying the brain processes and systems in real-world educational contexts so that we understand what are the brain mechanisms and systems involved, and this tells us information about when does the child have peak sensitivity to certain types of information, at what age do they need to be exposed, what are the critical periods, how plastic are neurally plastic systems, what are their limits, and how forgivable is the human brain if key periods in human development are somehow missed by the child. What can you pick up and catch up again? So I'll give you a couple examples of very dramatic findings that have implications for education, just as two instances. As you know, the human brain is extraordinarily responsive to its environment. There are dramatic adaptive changes. These are neurally plastic, experience-dependent changes in brain structure and brain function based on differences in environmental experiences. However, the brain is also very resilient, and I want to leave you with the point that not everything is neurally plastic, and things that are not neurally plastic are equally informative to us. All right, so we know, I'm not going to go into this, I'm getting somewhere else, but we know that the human child's brain changes dramatically in the acquisition of reading. We know that the child has fundamental brain shifts from inferior parietal lobe, forward fronting to the frontal lobe, left inferior frontal cortex, etc. So these are just neuroanatomic global changes that we see, so we know that your education and the teacher's training of reading does have an impact. But we also can understand when the child has peak sensitivity to certain parts of language and reading instruction, for example, phonological decoding, etc., and when we can remediate if those periods have been missed. Another example that we see are dramatic brain changes when the brain is exposed to one language versus two languages. We see fundamental change in the brain if the child is exposed to two languages later in the educational system as opposed to earlier. In fact, one of the most powerful predictors of reading success is a child's age of exposure to its two languages. The earlier a child, it's in fact very counterintuitive, the earlier a child is exposed to two languages, the stronger they are in each of their individual languages, the better readers they are in each of their individual languages, and yet we have an educational system that pulls them apart and has children being exposed to languages in a stage-like way. There's this notion somehow that exposure to the second language might contaminate the child in some way, cause language delay or confusion, and that somehow this is best given to a child in a step-like manner. So we have hardcore, very concrete information. I also would love a conversation with Arnie Duncan about the processes that are typical and healthy to afford advantages, linguistic and cognitive advantages to young children, which we're not doing. But now I'm going to turn to a different type of informative source that is beyond just neuroplasticity. These are areas of the human brain that are resilient, that resist change despite dramatically different environmental experiences. So let me get right to it. One of the most extraordinary findings of my own career for myself, that aha moment that a few of us are very lucky to have, was the discovery that deaf children who are exposed to sign language begin to babble on the identical timetable as hearing children begin to babble. Now this was remarkable. We viewed the onset of early vocal babbling as being determined by the maturation of the orofacial cavity, by the connections between the motor cortex and orofacial control. We also viewed it as being dovetailed with aspects of perception of sounds, and we viewed that the reason we see children's onset of vocal babbling is because it reflects the time in human development when the back of the larynx hooks up to the nasal cavity, permitting the jaw to drop and the air to come out. And so we have this sensation of ba, 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 ka, ka, ka. We have this sensation of open, close, open, close. So, in that view, exposure to sign language, a child who's stripped from sign language and exposed only to the hands should not babble. Instead, what we found is that they do. They babble on their hands, and the structural components that are in the babble are identical to the structural components that are in speech. So that suggested whatever it is that's controlling the onset of the milestone in spoken language is also controlling that in sign language. And so the question was, what was it? We then, I'll skip this, we then looked at a radical hypothesis, and the hypothesis that perhaps beyond being what psychologists say as a heuristic that it's the same mechanism, a bold hypothesis that it might involve the mediation by the identical brain tissue. And this really was a bold hypothesis at the time because the view was that we knew sign languages were lateralized in the left hemisphere, but no one dared to think that the tissue might be identical. And what we found is that when we gave deaf people meaningless movement units like this, which have no meaning to us, but have significance to them, these are meaningless phonetic units that make up all the signs a deaf person would make and make up all the sentences that they'll make in their language. They're meaningless phonetic units like ba, da, pa. And when they look at this, they access the identical tissue that a hearing person accesses when they listen to ba, ba, ta, phonetic units and sound. So this is quite extraordinary. It means that the tissue that's controlling sound is also controlling sign. So maybe we made somewhat of a mistake. Maybe it's not the actual sound that the tissue is set for, but aspects of the patterning that got pressed into human language. And that's in fact what we think is the case. In another study with Robert Sartori and Virginia Penhum, we looked at volumetric studies, volume by volume, voxel by voxel of gray and white matter, and we found that deaf and hearing brains, when their brains were scrambled and the neuroanatomical coders didn't even know what hemisphere they were in, when the blind fold was lifted, the gray and white matter for the deaf people and the hearing people was identical. So again, that tissue didn't shrivel up and die because it didn't get sound. Instead, it was alive and well. It meant that aspects of that were set to the patterning of human language, not to sound. So what's the educational implication of this? We were able to, with new technology, study the children's neural processing. This is the first time in history that we're able to look at neuroanatomical and temporal dynamics across the brain's hemisphere. This is a near-infrared spectroscopy system. It uses light. It's user-friendly. The child can sit on mom's lap, and it tolerates moderate movement. So now we can follow tracts of tissue over time. And following tracts of tissue, one of the things we've seen is that aspects of the planum temporale and the superior temporal gyrus are highly sensitive to rhythmic undulating patterns. It's like the sausage machine for the human brain. There's streams of linguistic information coming in, and it's the system in the brain that allows the child to chunk, 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 link, 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 from this blur of stimulation to find the unit that will become the critical phonological unit in their language, and to look then to do their distribution and frequency statistical analyses over that, from which they can find the inventory and from which they can find the word that even allows the child to find the meanings of words. And so what we found, quite extraordinarily, is that this rhythmic sense, this sensitivity to rhythmic patterns allowed the child to crack the code of the visual stream in the same way it allows the hearing child to crack the code of the auditory stream. And what we found is that if you're exposed to sign language early in life, those small meaningless units that you are seeing in the world, you are actually segmenting and setting up a visual sign phonology. Well, this was extraordinary. It meant that children who were profoundly deaf and learning to read weren't hopelessly lost because they didn't have access to sound and couldn't decode the print on the page with sound. They too were seeing the letter on the page, accessing aspects of the phonological unit from natural sign languages and decoding en route in that way. However, children who were not exposed to sign language, were not and only exposed to intensive speech training, bypassed this ability to set up the visual units that would have let them crack into reading. So just to show you what visual phonology is, in the same way that spoken language is made up of multiple units that make up the phonological level that allow the hearing child to decode, sign language early exposure allows the child to also segment the speech stream, the sound stream into these baby units. That in turn allows the child to have a phonological system. And what we see is that across the eyes and across the tongue, the brain imposes and finds a phonological level of organization that has very powerful impact. And it has educational impact if we want to make optimal readers. For one thing, the wars in education about phonics versus whole word, we have information on that. It's not an option. I was in a school in Vermont and they were so excited to tell me that they were, because little boys are more left brain, they've been training the little boys in phonology and phonological decoding, but little girls they were only training in whole word because they use their right brain. This was terrifying to me because it was making girls miss critical period in human development where they needed to have exposure to phonological segmentation information. And so these types of evidence are not being embraced in educational policy. Early experience is vital for all children. It's also vital for early experience of two languages and vital for the bilingual child. We see very extraordinary increases in phonological ability and in lexical access and in processing and even in brain organization. So I'll stop there and hope that through this discussion, findings of this sort that have been in laboratories for decades can really begin to be heard in the educational policy community. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. So my distinct pleasure to introduce Guinevere Eden. We actually had the pleasure of working together in the early 90s. She was 6, I think, when we started doing that, but a brilliant scientist, brilliant communicator, and who works particularly well known for its methodologic rigor in terms of very careful work that stands the test of time. And so my last wrestling analogy should be one who follows the rules and still wins in these, but really has been a creative leader in this field, and it's been great to see your success from our humble beginnings at NIH. Thanks, Guinevere.
Thank you, Jay. Jay reminded me that I came to the United States 21 years ago as a postdoctoral fellow at NIH, where we were next door to each other. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank AAAS and the Potomac Institute for having this meeting and for including me in the panel. The work that we do is highly collaborative. I'm at Georgetown University, but I collaborate with Gallaudet University, Wake Forest University, and others to try and understand the brain basis of reading, and our work is supported by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the National Science Foundation. One of the areas that's received a lot of interest is, of course, how research in brain mapping and in neuroscience can inform educational practices. And I think the area of reading and literacy and numerosity and math education have been of primary interest and seem to be the obvious examples where we should be able to make some impact and bring education and neuroscience together the way Laura Ann just described. And so what I'd like to do here is focus on the area of reading, because that's the area that we've been interested in, and sort of outline for you where the neuroscience research has made impact, where we have learned from educational practices when we design our studies in neuroscience, and how we hope that what we learn will also impact educational practices. But I do want to make the point that this is a two-way street, that this is not neuroscience informing education, but it's education informing neuroscience and vice versa, and that these are reciprocal relationships that need to continue, and they happen through collaboration and understanding of our very respective fields and bringing these together. One of the things that's so interesting about studying the neural basis for reading is that it's a very special skill. It's one that's uniquely human, it's one that is a cultural invention, and it's one that we haven't been using for all that long compared to, say, for example, spoken language, which we've had for hundreds of thousands of years. Written language is very recent. There are no brain systems that are dedicated to it. We essentially hijack the brain and we make it do something that is important for our culture, for our learning situation, and is required in schools. And we have to use brain areas that were dedicated probably for something else, primarily areas in language, particularly those involved in phonological processing, and areas in the object visual processing stream to recognize the complex symbols that we use. And we do that in different ways, and we do it in different cultures, as indicated here by early examples of logographic writing systems and the alphabetic writing system. There are many things that we know about reading from many, many years of research in education and in psychology. We know that it involves mapping. We know that it involves bringing together the visual information, the word form through orthography, with the sound representation or its phonology, so that we can access meaning of the word and meaning of the sentence that we're reading. We know that there are skills that children who have those skills are more likely to succeed in acquiring reading skills. Skills such as understanding the alphabetic principle, having phonological awareness, and also having strong oral language skills are all the kinds of things that set a child up for successful learning to read. And we also know that how children learn to read is modulated by several factors, one of which is the language that they speak, another is the writing system in which they learn to read, and there are other things such as sex and IQ and social class that will affect how children are, how successful they are at learning to read. And so this means that we have a very rich literature by which to begin to understand the neural basis of reading, or the kinds of skills that we know that are related to reading. And just to give you some example from these kinds of studies, we have information on the brain basis for reading, how it changes across development. We also can integrate it with behavioral measures that are used in the classroom or in clinical settings to evaluate progress in reading and reading-related skills. We also understand that how the brain is organized for reading depends somewhat on the writing system, and we can use the information from these studies to influence theories about reading. So just to give you an example, here's an example of a study from our lab showing you how the brain changes. This is a functional magnetic resonance imaging study showing kind of a developmental trajectory from beginning readers to more skilled readers, and the areas that change as we become more advanced and more skilled at reading. We can take brain function and relate it to behavior measured outside of the scanner, in this case neuropsychological tests that are often used in the classroom, or not in the classroom but in the school setting or in a clinical setting, to begin to identify what is the relationship between how good a child, in this case, for example, is at rapid automatized naming that Dr. Denkler spoke about, and the amount of brain activity that we see in the brain when those children are reading in the scanner. What is the relationship between those? And that sort of begins to build a bridge between what we see in the brain and what we measure in a neuropsychological evaluation or in an assessment that is done by the school. People have done studies in reading around the globe and have identified similarities but also differences depending on the writing system in which you are born into. So the demands that are made perhaps of a symbolic representation that has a highly spatial, complex visual form and doesn't follow an alphabetic principle is somewhat different than the alphabetic principle, so we know that there are differences there. And it's taken, this information has been used in addition to the behavioral work that's already predated this work to provide more informative models of reading. For example, just to cite the wonderful work of Stan DeHaan here from his book, recognizing the complexity of the reading system, but also pointing out that what we do when we learn to read is not only utilize language systems that are already in place, but we also recruit areas such as these regions in the visual system, such as what's been termed the visual word form area, that now become interconnected with the language in ways that allows us to map the visual information to language and produce what we are reading. One very important aspect of this is to recognize that there are children who have difficulties in learning to read. Reading disability or dyslexia is very common, and it's a significant problem because if you can't read, you can't access much of the information that you're trying to learn in school. And again, the brain research here has been somewhat helpful also in informing models of reading, as well as understanding the neural basis for reading disability. And so not only have investigators mapped differences between dyslexic and non-dyslexic participants, but they also have looked at what happens when we apply an intervention and see a successful gain in reading. What is the neural correlate? What happens in the brain when dyslexic readers do in fact make gains? And again, it's helped us understand models of reading and reading disability. It's now also been used as a way to try and understand what reading outcome may look like in students with and without dyslexia, and also, again, has informed theoretical frameworks. So to give you some concrete examples, here's a study comparing dyslexics and controls during a sound deletion task, and there are many studies around the world showing, for example, that there's less activity in areas such as inferior parietal cortex in dyslexic readers even when they can do the task. And we can also go in and provide an intervention and bring about gains in reading. And it's important in this case that the interventions not only train one particular skill, but that the skill generalizes to skills such as reading. It's not that you just want to get better at phonemic awareness, but you also want to get better at single word reading and deriving meaning from print. And here we have an example of changes. These are actually adults. It's sort of interesting, even though we really need to focus on young dyslexic readers, there is hope for dyslexic readers in their 40s and 50s. The brain does change and reading does improve later in life. And here are the brain areas that contribute to those changes. They involve not just the left hemisphere, but also the right hemisphere, which appears to be compensating somewhat. This is an example of a reading intervention that was developed by clinicians that we applied in a school setting and studied it. So it's not that we as the neuroscientists devised the intervention, but there are such studies. So these are happening in real classroom situations also where neuroscientists are coming in, collaborating with educators and devising interventions based on educational neuroscience research and evaluating those. We also know that there are anatomical changes. Experience-dependent plasticity has been a great focus in the field of neuroscience. First sort of gained interest when scientists observed what happens in the brains of college students when they juggle balls, and they would notice changes in visual systems. Of course, a more meaningful way, I think, to ask the question is what happens when children with dyslexia make gains in reading. What is the neural change that we see not just in function, but also in gray matter? And here's an example of such a study. And these studies also have the benefit that they point us to areas that we may not have necessarily paid much attention to before. And what's interesting is that when we see changes in anatomy, they do not necessarily map onto the same areas where we see brain function, reminding us that the issue is probably more complex and there are areas that we need to pay more attention to, and that refocuses our designs of new studies. Here's an example of a study by Fumiko Hooft showing how functional MRI data is predictive of reading in children with dyslexia 2 years down the road. So you see children with dyslexia, you look at brain function and you notice that it is predictive of their reading further down the road. So this opens, and I think is now beginning to show you the transition from, how education may inform and influence the design of studies that are done in neuroscience to the other way around, where again, we're looking at neuroscience perhaps playing a role together with education to try and understand which brain areas can tell us something about who may be likely to succeed versus who may not be so likely to succeed. And another way to think about this is in a way that gets back to Dr. Denkler's comments, which is something about brain readiness. I think there is great potential in understanding something about which child is likely to be ready to learn to read by looking at anatomical or functional data in ways where we are looking at it as a way that it's providing a signal of readiness of learning to read, and that we then would proceed appropriately in terms of the educational setting. One of the things that's interesting about reading is that reading itself changes the brain. Here's an interesting study that was published in Nature a few years ago by Kathy Price's group, showing that when you take adults who've never had the opportunity to learn to read, in this case because they were involved in guerrilla warfare in Colombia, then you have them learn to read and compare them to their peers who never did learn to read. We see changes in brain function and brain anatomy. Here's the example of brain anatomy. This is gray matter volume. So learning to read changes the brain. And this is interesting. It's not surprising. I think teachers have known this for some time, that what they're doing is changing the brain. But it also becomes important when we consider things like dyslexia, where we identify differences in the brain in dyslexic children compared to their peers. But now we begin to ask the question, well, why are these differences there? So these anatomical differences here, for example, in dyslexia, are they there because they are the cause of the reading problem, or are they the consequence of children with dyslexia not learning to read at the same level of their peers? So it is sort of a circle where we know that the brain in some ways has some readiness, and some brains are more likely to succeed in acquiring reading skills than others. But we also know that the act of learning to read itself also changes the brain, and that's an important concept to be aware of. And then just finally, I think one of the other things where we can make some advances here in bridging between education and neuroscience is using these kinds of designs that perhaps are more valid, where we try not just to compare, in this case, individuals with dyslexia to their age match controls, but also to children who are younger and reading at the same level. And I just want to end with an example of where we've recently applied this. Dyslexia is controversial in some regards, that there are many alternative theories about what may cause dyslexia. And one area I've been interested in is the role of the visual system, an area in the brain that's interested in, for example, visual motion perception, where there's been evidence for some time to show that there are differences in dyslexic and non-dyslexic students. And we showed these differences by comparing dyslexics and non-dyslexics and showing that V5MT, an area in the dorsal visual stream, is different between dyslexic and non-dyslexic students. But we also found recently that that difference is no longer there once you match the dyslexic students to younger typical readers, suggesting perhaps that this may be a difference that's not so much a cause of dyslexia, but more of an outcome of learning to read. And we're learning more and more about what reading does to the brain, not just in terms of reading, but also in visual processing, and that's been found in other studies also. Then we can apply a very sort of commonly type of intervention approach, where we have students improve reading by learning phonological awareness and learning to read. And we find that the students who are in this intervention not only make gains in reading, but they also increase the signal in area V5MT, which is involved in visual motion perception. And so again, this sort of suggests that this is a consequence of improving reading, and we do not see it when the students are involved in a math intervention that's happening at the same time, showing that it's very specific to the process of learning to read. So I think what I'm trying to do here is really sort of show from what we've learned from this field, but also now how we're beginning to integrate it into true educational neuroscience, not just that we understand the brain basis for things that students are learning in the classroom, but also that it informs our theories, it provides support for some of the theories, it provides clarifications perhaps on competing theories, and it also has a potential role in determining the best educational practices. And I think where we're really looking forward to more work is these kind of neural indices that may be more helpful than perhaps behavioral data. For example, it's been somewhat disappointing that there aren't very good behavioral markers of student outcome predicting future reading in students with dyslexia undergoing intervention. Even though we have those for typical readers, it may be that brain imaging will play an important role in predicting the outcome of dyslexic readers prior to an intervention, telling us something about how they will fare in the intervention. So going back to this collaboration, I just want to emphasize again, I think it's a transfer of information in both directions between neuroscience and educational practices. Like Laura Ann mentioned, it's not just that, but it should be a true marriage, a partnership, and a common understanding. And importantly, this marriage has to happen to bridge a gap that still is somewhat big. Also, I think, because teachers want this information. Teachers are very excited. Jay Geed mentioned earlier the conferences that are attended by teachers and the interest that they have in this. And if we as scientists do not provide the information for the teachers, that gap, that void will be filled by others. And I think many of us also have concerns about how some of that gap is being filled and making accessible programs and approaches that haven't had the benefit of proper studies. And we really need to make sure that we provide those studies so that the information that is put into the schools has a research-based foundation. So I'd like to thank you, and thank you again for including me in the panel.
Thank you very much, Guinevere. So our last panel member, Brett Miller, is also in the trenches of actually trying to help us move the neuroscience advances to help people, to actually affect lives and classrooms, and touching upon themes of plasticity, the importance of sleep, and other topics of wide interest. Take it away, Brett. Thanks.
So I have the benefit of being last, which, given I know some of the speakers that were ahead of me, I had a sense for some of the content that they had likely hit on. So some of it's going to be a rather quick description of some of those points, just the ones that I wanted to hit on previously. One thing that I think will be useful for context, for those of you in this room who don't know me, so I oversee a research portfolio at NIH. The value of that is that it gives me a different view, potentially a broader view of some of the work that's coming out. I get a perspective view as well as a retrospective view on the field, which is a privilege of the position. But it also, at some level, gives me a chance to have some liberties and going a bit broader in terms of the sorts of content coverage that I might otherwise have done if I was still working in a lab. So with that, here it goes. So what I want to hit on are a few points. So some examples of impact, and I'm using impact or potential impact here. In some cases, I would say I'm modestly more optimistic than I think Martha was on the lead-in, but modest is pretty much where we're at least the current state of affairs. So impact or potential impact of the neurosciences, and I'm using the plural here just to think about the different particular subdisciplines within neuroscience. And one thing I want to hit on is kind of moving keeping in mind that a lot of what we're talking about is at the rather micro level. So we might be talking about reading instruction occurring within a classroom, but all of these activities are embedded in a system, in the educational system, and it has implications when you make any sort of change. And I think we need to pay attention and be thoughtful about potential ramifications, whether intended or not, to some of the changes that we're proposing, as well as being sensitive to the structuring of the system such that the recommendations can actually be actionable by the individuals that would need to be doing these. So what I want to hit on are a few points: conceptualizing and grounding reading disability as a brain-based learning disability. I think we've made some real success there. And success in large part is the last bullet, which I think has been empowering for educators, and I'll hit on that a little bit. It hasn't necessarily led to the breadth of change in practice that I think some of us would want to see, but it certainly has set the groundwork for an understanding and appreciation of the value of neuroscience, can provide education that I think is a useful vehicle to move forward with some of the positive changes that we could see in the setting. And a little bit on plasticity and brain systems as well. So I'm going to use reading disabilities as an exemplar. Part of the reason for that is it's a little more in my comfort zone than some of the other learning disabilities, and frankly it's the best studied learning disability at this point. So one of the things I wanted to mention, you'll also notice I tend to use text heavy, so I apologize for that. I appreciate pictures, but I tend not to use them so much. Maybe that's from being in government this long, but one of the things I wanted to hit on is early differences in how people process sound. So there's some early indicators of risk for reading disability. And so there's some work that was done in the early 2000s using EEG in infants and essentially looking at ERPs, so evoked related potentials, to speech and non-speech cues, distinguishing between at-risk and not at-risk children. So you're seeing basically what they found is differences in how infants were processing these speech and non-speech cues based upon their later risk for developing a reading disability. So this is longitudinal work. This is work that's come primarily out of a couple labs, but other individuals have done it as well. And I think what it speaks to is, we have information about early indicators of risk. Some of them are behavioral markers, others like this are more neural markers that we can potentially think about how we can advantage ourselves to take advantage of where we put resources in a world that has limited resources to really try to amp up those who are at most risk for having reading problems. And we've also had a good sense for this issue of heritability. So there's been a host of behavior genetic studies indicating significant heritability for reading disabilities. I was pointed out that heritability is often misinterpreted, so I left a cue to the interpretation for it in some of the various labs that have looked at it. But the key point is that reading and reading disability is highly heritable. The heritability range varies depending upon the sorts of measures that you're looking at, but there is a strong genetic component to later performance in this skill. But I want to also indicate that there's also strong environmental and gene by environmental interaction for this as well. So it's not we're identifying risk. We're not talking about a mandated outcome in this case. Also, I want to hit on a few points in terms of neuroimaging informing the reading circuit in the brain. So Guinevere presented some of this, so I'm going to go a little quickly over this, but we've used a host of neuroimaging technologies to really give us a better sense of the brain regions that are utilized in reading for both typically and atypically developing readers. And I want to keep in mind, as Guinevere also pointed out, that reading is a relatively new invention. So we're taking advantage of these biological systems that are in place that were developed for other purposes, primarily language development, and utilizing them also for reading, in this case of print. I want to give a caveat that some of the other slides moving forward are a little Anglo-centric in terms of thinking about English as the data point. I think there's a lot of overlap when we look at other writing systems in terms of the regions that are activated, but I want you to be sensitive to the fact that this is a little more English-centric. And also that I tend to present relatively high-level sort of characterizations of the regions involved. This is and admittedly oversimplified view of the sorts of developmental changes that occur when children are learning to read. And so, but at a high level, basically what you're seeing is some activation in a wide range of regions in the brain, particularly in the anterior and the temporal parietal region. So this is the left hemisphere. I'm not suggesting that there's not right hemisphere involvement or subcortical involvement, but I'm going to be focusing on the left. And this sort of skill migration to this left occipital temporal region, which encompasses the visual word form region that Guinevere mentioned earlier. And so again, you tend to see, as development occurs, this more focal sort of activation and movement towards activation in the occipital temporal region, as well as retaining in the anterior and the temporal parietal. But I think what's interesting in the context of this meeting is this sort of response to instruction that we see as an exemplar of brain plasticity. So in response to successful behavioral intervention, and its key here is successful, you see these sort of normalization, for lack of a better term, of systems in response. So it doesn't mean that after successful intervention that a reader who was struggling before, perhaps had a reading disability, has a system that's going to look identical to kind of this prototypical reading system for an individual that doesn't have a reading disability. But it does mean that there's this sort of migration towards more focal activation and more of this movement to the left occipital temporal region. One of the other things that I think is important in terms of thinking, in the context of reading, is that plasticity extends well beyond early childhood into adulthood. So Guinevere had mentioned this, and she's got some work looking at adults with that. The Kim Pugh study that I was intending to list here references use of repetition to high frequency and low frequency words to show that despite having a reading disability and being at that point an adolescent, the system still had some inherent plasticity that could be taken advantage of. The reason I think this is important is if we look at our behavioral interventions for reading in particular, we have far greater success in terms of remediation for the interventions that are done relatively early. And the current state of the science is finding it challenging to get large movement, particularly in reading comprehension and in reading fluency for later readers who continue to struggle. So you need to keep in mind these are individuals that have had a host of instructional interventions for a number of years and may have been minimally responsive to strong, efficacious instruction. So it could be really difficult to remediate reading disability that we're facing. So, we're looking at a truncated set of individuals here rather than kind of the broader set of readers. Or individuals that potentially may not have received what for them would have been the most efficacious sort of reading system, and we missed some periods where perhaps the brain had somewhat greater plasticity to resolve. That doesn't, but saying this, I think the message is we need to be thinking richly about dosage and length of time that we're giving intervention, the sorts of interventions we're delivering when we have individuals that have struggled for numerous years to gain a skill, and in this case, reading. And where my hope is for neuroscience in particular having a particular impact is this idea of understanding what we mean by minimal response. So what are the characteristics of learners who are likely to be minimal responders to intervention? And having a better understanding of the mechanisms and characteristics of these individuals will hopefully help us develop more powerful interventions to address their needs. As well as, to Guinevere's point, hopefully give us a better cue for using a predictive lens to be able to identify who those individuals might be earlier on, such that we can think about resource allocation for those individuals as well as the types of interventions that we might want to apply. So I'm going to shift gears pretty abruptly here. I'm taking a little bit of liberty and trying to go broad rather than deep on some of the recommendations that one might take away from the broader literature in neurosciences. And one that gets a bit of play, particularly in my group at NIH, is the role of sleep. So in this range, kind of sleep to facilitate learning. So you can think of it in a range of ways. You can think about it as a function of consolidation of memory in terms of sleep's role in learning. And you can think about it as recovery from, for lack of a better term, kind of cognitive fatigue. So you want people alert, ready to learn when they're rolling into school, and ready to attend. And there's some recommendations that on the surface seem relatively straightforward to adapt. So things like adjusting the start time for school, so delaying essentially to allow for additional time for sleep. There's been a little bit of work that's looked at that that has shown some increases in overall length of sleep for individuals that attend school, higher levels of rated alertness while at school, things of that nature. There are potentially impacts of making this sort of change on the system, and I'll try to allude to one of those on the last slide. So this idea that, anytime you make a change to part of the system, you can have some unintended consequences for the broader system. One area that I think often is discussed as well is thinking about teacher training. So this idea of enhancing professional development and basic knowledge about relationships of neuroscience to education. So these are individuals as well as broader administrative staff at school who are involved in making selections regarding the sorts of instructional programs that are being implemented, the sorts of structural changes that they might want to implement in the school or school district. And to the extent that we can have this sort of reciprocal relationship with them, that there can be an understanding of their issues as well as a conveyance of what the state of the science is regarding to neuroscience, at least at a level that is actionable for them. So my recommendation is not to have individuals all be neuroscientists, but to have a functional knowledge, and functional will depend on what your role is. But in this case, they're going to need to make decisions that are going to help inform the choice of intervention. It's not uncommon and when we think about packages that are being marketed, a lot of them being described as brain-based, and giving them some information to think about what might constitute brain-based and what might be meaningful for them in their particular context. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we really, in this case, trying to seat neuroscience in the context of behavior, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to change. And the other point I wanted to make is that I think as a field we need to be thinking about applying principles from cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience to training. And so some of this onus is really on us to think about how we're conveying this information. And our understanding of how people reason, our understanding of the sorts of errors in logic that are common, and keeping them in mind in terms of the presentation, the availability of information, doing simple things like not having one-off trainings on a topic and expecting a person to then transition into a school setting and implement it. Take what we know about training and apply it to a more concerted effort to make this sort of transition of neuroscience and education and making that a nice, connected, reciprocal relationship. And I also want to hit on the point that we need to remember that we're working with the system. And an integrated service delivery system at that. So keep in mind that the role of neuroscience can inform these sort of both system level change as well as more kind of classroom level change. So if we think about different levels in a system, you can think about neuroscience as connecting at each level as well as thinking about the system as a whole. So to kind of play off this idea that we're talking about an integrated system and sometimes we have unintended consequences for changes, one that often, at least in some of the contexts that I'm citing, if we talk about potentially delaying the start of a school day, to allow for more sleep for individuals, we have a host of activities that children are involved in or adolescents are involved in. And some of the times for scheduling reasons, they choose to move those on the front end of the day. So you moved a start of a day back half an hour to only have swim team meet from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. instead of potentially after school. And so you can have the system working for you or against you, but understanding the system that you're working within and working as a team with individuals both on the neuroscience side and on the education side, I think will help us to where hopefully we'll see more of what we know instantiated in practice and have a better understanding from the education community and the practice community about what their needs are, and frankly self-reflect on whether we have the data to address their needs or not at this point. And with that I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Beth. So now we have some time for question and discussion. So we're going to have the speakers come up to the table here. And also for people that are online, if you can tweet questions using hashtag NeuroEDU. So hashtag NEUROEDU. Maybe we'll even get some students weighing in if they're not in school today. But I'm going to start out just with one question for each of the panelists from me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. People asking questions from here, if you could please use the microphone so that the online people can hear the questions as well. Dr. Dankla, one of the most powerful statements I think you said was that the education for your grandchildren is worse than for your children, which is that's a bold statement, given that we now have smart boards and technologies and Khan Academy and TED Talks and those sort of things. So I just wondered if you could comment that a bit as well in terms of what obstacles are in the way from allowing us to use these modern technologies to improve.
Well, because the technologies don't address the basic problem of the development of the human brain, and no matter what technology you have, if you try to get blood from a stone, which is having people do things when they're not developmentally able to do them, then you're going to, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether, what I saw in, just very quick, let me give you a very concrete example. My middle son, technically, I know I put him in a lot of studies, so I know he's sorted out as being dyslexic brain, okay? Mild. He went to school in Tenafly, New Jersey, in a very good public school system, which had multi-age classrooms, which was using a very individualized curriculum with things that people now make fun of, with different stations and bits of rugs and what have you. And he came out of the first grade saying, I can read a lot of words, but I don't get that phonics stuff. So he had a little help and boost and this and that. Remember, in those days, he's now 46 years old, he had no homework. He was going at his own pace. He was kind of passed along within this multi-age classroom. And to make a long story short, he was never classified as learning disabled. He never had to do anything very special, and he went on to, go to Columbia and to Fordham Law School and do just fine. Now his daughter, who seemed to have inherited his problem, in a very good public school in New York, very comparable area, very comparable, but she was asked to do first grade curriculum in kindergarten. And so she became extremely frustrated, developed school refusal, had to be transferred out of the public school into a private school that would allow her to have intensive, quote-unquote, remediation, and had a lot of secondary hatred of school that has only just now resolved in the 7th grade when we finally convinced the science teacher that answers that were misspelled but could be made out to be correct could be accepted as correct. So I'm just giving you a 2-generation, and by the way, these are people with both very high IQs. So that's just an example of if you put pressure on people prematurely in terms of what really absolutely has to happen. And I was giving you an example of people who are at the mild end of the dyslexic spectrum, whose only surviving problems as even middle schoolers is spelling. So they're not the real hardcore, lousy, rotten readers, as Frank Valentino would say. So that just gives you one flavor. I don't care what technology, I don't care. The point is, if you put premature demands on people, it has very severe consequences. In my profession, they say prima non nocere. First of all, do thou no harm. And that's what I fear is happening.
Laura, my question for you is a kind of a similar theme of that we raised many very interesting possible themes for us to pursue, but one of them is this whole idea of when, in terms of the timing of brain development and the right educational approach at the right age, and being highly individualized. So not all 6-year-olds will probably be at just the exact same stage for reading or math, or history. And how much we can individualize education with neuroscience. Can we kind of get a sense of where people are brain-wise in terms of, are they ready for arithmetic, algebra, calculus, or is that sort of not a worthwhile approach to individualize education based on neuroscience markers?
I wouldn't advocate that we have to go to individualize, but I do strongly want to reinforce something Dr. Denkel said, is that there seems to be a mismatch between what we know about brain development, its maturation over time, and the structure of educational policy, some of which are at strong odds. So there isn't, and what does knowing about brain development tell you? It helps you understand what types of information a child has peak sensitivity to at a particular developmental time. And if we knew that, how to make that available in that period of sensitivity. Because it is not the case that the child is just wildly neurally plastic. There are maturation of certain systems that have peaked readiness. So one of the things that's been so exciting in my own field is to discover that this thing we called language with a capital L, that, and we have linguists who with a wonderful taxonomy were able to identify the different levels of language organization. And is that just that we're smart taxonomers, or is there anything to that? And one of the most exciting things in my own lifetime to have witnessed is that this thing we called language with parts called phonology, morphology, syntax, etc., that each one of those parts have dedicated brain tissue that are participating in mediating that function. And we see that the child has peak sensitivity to those parts, and the brain is more forgiving for some of those parts than others. So child is born with the capacity to discriminate any speech sound or hand sign that they could be exposed to. Hearing or deaf, we have the ability to discriminate linguistic units to any structure of any world language. And what's a remarkable brain change over the first year of life is that open capacity dramatically attenuates in the first year of life. So that by 12 months of age, one of the jokes in child language on this is the child gets worse as they grow up rather than better. They lose the universal capacity to discriminate the speech sounds, but then get an increased capacity to discriminate the fine-grained sounds in their native language. So nature does a swap, allows you to have this open capacity, and then you attenuate down, and that attenuating down is happening in the first year of life. And if you get 2 languages in that period, you literally wedge open that attenuation. So you have the child stay open longer in the ability to discriminate these sounds. And when the child's staying open longer, they're getting richer abilities to identify words and vocabulary, which we know is related to language, which we know is related to language competence, and which we know is related to better reading. So we have this information about timing and when to make information available. And then we look at school systems and educational programs that are structured in a way that flies in the face of that biological information. So there's a fear of early exposure of 2 languages. There's a fear of exposing children to 2 reading systems at the same time. Ironically, the brain sets up stronger reading systems when they're close in time. Instead of having in the sequential exposure, that's when we do see transference and interference. So we have brain development that teaches us about specific parts of language sensitivity. And when the child has peak sensitivity to that, And then we have educational policy, that somehow there's a gap that's not using that. And I think we can bridge that. And there are many ways we can bridge that, and I think we have to. Because, yes, the brain is forgiving, and there's other routes that we can take, and the child can, catapult over certain problems, and there are compensatory processes. But if you're talking about facilitating optimal growth, we do have that information, and we can use it if we can closer marry educational policy and training for teachers and expectations in society with the neurosciences.
Yeah, the educational system is sometimes called the largest uncontrolled experiment in the world. And in terms of how much data should be available for these kind of cognitive sequences. And so one of the things internationally that's striking is how many different approaches there are, from teaching reading at age 4 in many parts of the world, to in Finland not till 7, and they actually do the best on at age 11 in terms of maybe the brain isn't supposed to be reading at 4, it's supposed to be playing or doing other things. So maybe there's like evidence already there in terms of sort of brain maturation education. Even things like geometry and algebra I found surprisingly inconsistent. So some countries they teach geometry first, on the basis of that part of the brain that matures early, and others it's algebra first, but no really great compelling reason of which order or sequence is best. So I think that's one of the steps forward is, and Guinevere mentioned this as well, the two-way street in terms of neuroscientists learning from educators and educators from neuroscientists about timing. It seems to be a real important factor here in terms of when to teach what, and these kind of myths of sort of another myth is earlier is always better, and we need to get away from that notion to sort of the optimal time. But thanks. So Guinevere, this is probably unfair because it's only very peripherally related to some of the content of your talk, but in terms of interventions and what to do for things like dyslexia, there's burgeoning sort of industry and things like Lumosity and computer-based interventions and online interventions. And I just wonder if you could share some of your kind of overall thoughts both on the current state and future in terms of I know there's probably some hype and marketing considerations, but is there a baby in that bathwater? Is it a path for parents to consider?
So this is something that I sort of alluded to at the end of my talk, and I think it is really very important, and it's important for several reasons. Parents who learn that their child has a reading problem go online and try and identify methods or get information about what may help their child. And there's a lot of information out there, and not all of it is based on solid research. And as a parent, you don't know necessarily about the need for randomized controlled studies in order to evaluate the efficacy of that kind of research. And these parents are a vulnerable population. You see parents trying every program that's out there, mortgaging their homes in order to afford those programs, and essentially running one sort of in-house trial after another with their children, trying to see whether they benefit from one program or another. And it's a problem, for several reasons. Of course, it's terrible for these individuals to kind of fall prey to a system that's not ideal, and these programs are out there. They don't necessarily work for their child, but we also do know what does work, and so there have been some steps that have been taken in that direction. So I remember when the Institute of Educational Sciences instituted the website on the What Works Clearinghouse to try and have sort of more of a mechanism to try to understand, well, what kinds of studies do we have out there that provide information about what approaches or what programs work. And in some ways, that's sort of you can think of that as the equivalent of not having something like FDA approval for reading programs and those kinds of things that are out there. So that certainly was a step in the right direction. But in the end, parents aren't scientists. They really need to be able to work with team of professionals, people at the school, have access to organizations. I served as president of the International Dyslexia Association, and what IDA does is try to make information available so that professionals and parents sort of begin to understand what are the things that you need to be looking for, what are the questions you should be asking when you consider what avenue to pick for your child. And it's very hard to, as a parent, when you're so concerned about your child, to even once you understand those principles, to necessarily stick with them, because of course it's a very emotional problem. And so, in neuroscience we've seen sort of interesting phenomena in the areas of reading, in the areas of executive function, working memory programs that have been either produced by scientists and then gone into the industry and been marketed very strongly, that have been very seductive, I think, for parents and for practitioners to use. A lot of hype at the beginning, and then a few years later, once more people had done research on it, the excitement has sort of waned and wasn't as great as we all thought it would be, even though it may have been actually nicely framed in principles that we know about in neuroscience. And so that's sort of one disappointment. The other disappointment are programs that are out there that don't have any research-based evidence. It's all sort of in-house evidence, or it's even less than that. There are no control groups. These are based on statements. Again, it's very seductive for parents to try and get these programs. And what they then tend to do, and this is sort of the flip side of the neuroscience contribution, is that they'll cite perhaps publications saying, based on this paper, that's evidence to show that our program works, when in fact that paper has nothing to do with this particular program. And so it's I think people are very convinced when they hear, oh, this program changes the brain. And I think it's always important to remind parents that having breakfast changes the brain. And it's not just changing the brain. What you're trying to change is the child's behavior, not just one kind of behavior, but behavior that generalizes. And that's been the key problem, I think, to many of these programs, whether it's in executive function or in reading, is yes, you can teach people to come better on the task that a program trains, but how well do they generalize, and how well do they generalize to the skills that are important in the classroom to succeed in the classroom? And that's where I think the biggest problem is in this marriage, is that scientists, I think, we're somewhat hesitant we're not that good at communicating our findings to the educational community, and in the absence of good communication, it opens a void that is filled by people who are perhaps a little more interested in making money, and it becomes problematic. And that's what then I think people in education will go for, is that they grasp for some of these programs, even though they haven't been validated in the ways they should be.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I realize I've talked way too much about wrestling, and the other is that I fear I might have been sort of nihilistic, and that this bridge too far, that we haven't done that. But I actually am much more in line with Lorraine. I think we have made amazing progress. But as a parent, I'm still facing this frustration of, why is this taking so long to get to my children in terms of classroom reform? And so that's the onus I'm going to put on Brett to kind of use your sort of broad perspective notion. So what are the main obstacles that we need to overcome to speed up the laboratory to classroom transition? Or maybe you feel that it is going just fine. But what gets in the way? Why is it so hard to go from a paper that discusses how to memorize things and how to keep memory in long-term and medium and short-term, that decades later it's still not implemented in the day-to-day classrooms?
I think
not blaming you.
Yeah, no, you can blame me. That's fine. I think there's a host of reasons. So you've got some expectation that there's going to be somewhat of, at least I have an expectation that there's going to be somewhat of a delay from going from lab to the classroom. Part of that is a good thing, that we want an opportunity to replicate. We want an opportunity to have a better understanding of the phenomenon, and to your point, the robustness of the phenomenon, and have a better understanding of how, if we're thinking about it in the context of intervention, how we can most efficaciously train it, what does it transfer to, what does it not, so that we know how to embed it in the broader context of what might be a bigger intervention, if it's a smaller component, or an intervention of it itself. That aside, there's a host of barriers, though, in terms of getting something that's efficacious into practice. So the education system's not optimally designed for easy sort of penetration of information. So you've got a system that has multiple different levels. You've got a local level, you've got a state level, and you've got a federal level. So you've got this very complex system where individuals at each level are making different sorts of choices. So, there was a comment about the Common Core state standards, that being a state-driven process. There's been some encouragement of these sort of standards from the Federal Department of Education, but the standards themselves were a part of the National Government Association, and Gates was involved in a few other groups. But that's just it's a standard, it's not a curriculum. So it doesn't tell you how to enact those standards, whether you agree with the standard or not. And so you've got this sort of state level kind of translation of the standards if they choose to adopt them, or college and career readiness standards, a similar sort of model. And then you've got kind of individual school level implementation of a particular program in practice. And so, we need information about what the efficacious practices are to get to publishers that are developing interventions. We need them to get to state level PD if it's the sort of practice that could be implemented now. It needs to be able to make it to policymakers in order to inform policies that would allow for sufficient robustness such that people could implement those policies. And so it's this idea of providing flexibility where flexibility is appropriate while constraining to give a sense for kind of here's the scope that we want you to focus on. So as a constraint idea, you can imagine a scenario where, trying to give a good example. So we give flexibility on the implementation of an intervention, but we have an expectation of feedback regarding each of the groups. So for instance, individuals with learning disabilities to have a good sense for how they're performing so that we know individuals coming from impoverished backgrounds, that they're also succeeding, that we're not getting kind of movement for one subset, but we're seeing a broader movement in this set of individuals that we're looking at. I think what else? And then you've got monetary aspects that, you can imagine a training scenario where there's professional development available, but finding time for teachers and educators to actually have the opportunities to do it is limited. Administrators have to make difficult decisions about where to put their resources for that. And then you've got issues of following that training in a way to where, let's say somebody's been introduced to a concept related to kind of the neurobiology of reading and what the ramifications are for instruction. But yet we don't follow through the professional development in a way to where when the instructor goes in the classroom and tries out one of the practices that was mentioned, they don't get an opportunity to come back, reflect on that process, maybe discuss some of the challenges that they had because there wasn't sufficient professional development money to have this extended training over time, which we've got a good body of data suggesting that, training, behavior change is hard. It takes time, and it takes resources.
Yeah, I think potentially some high-level policy changes would really be helpful. So we do kind of a wonders of the brain K through 12 the neuroscience part, and in the community here, I can't get into the public schools. Private schools are great, like sign us up, and we have props, and we have myelin, and we have games and stuff that we play. With the public schools, it's not on the test, or it's not on how they're assessed. So I found that kind of frustrating since my children go to public schools, that there's a huge resistance to interacting with the researchers, something kind of loosely, our children aren't guinea pigs kind of mentality, I think. But I think if at higher levels, such as like the AP Psych curriculum, in 15 minutes, if we did this nationwide, we could show a stimulus on a screen, they use those response boxes, we could get 10,000 data points in 20 minutes. That could help us understand how children remember, what works in terms of teaching interventions. And there's a lot of resistance, to doing that. And I'm not sure at what level that resistance could be eased, because I think it would be great for the students, for the teachers, for our country.
Can I make 2 quick points?
Sure.
So one is kind of reflecting on our side. I don't think we do as good of a job on articulating similarities in messages when policies change. So kind of that we have this underlying current of understanding what good practice is, let's say in reading. And you switch from one particular initiative to a different initiative at a policy level, but not making connections for individuals who are enacting them about similarities of what's known, and we're retaining the aspects that are efficacious, and we're adjusting them in light of what we've learned from previous policies. I think we do a pretty bad job of doing that, instead of presenting them as new. And the second point, kind of to your point about guinea pigs, a common retort I make to that is that if we're implementing a program in practice that we don't have data regarding its efficacy, essentially we're doing a natural experiment.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that,
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's the reality. So when there's pushback in that regard, I think it's useful for that as a context.
So I'm going to open things up for the audience, and if you could just step up to the mic and ask a question so that the online viewers can hear as well. That'd be great. You can be first, sir.
What am I? Right there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Right.
Hi, I'm Bob Slavin from Johns Hopkins University. I am not a neuroscientist. I don't even play one on television. But I do follow education interventions a great deal. And I think that in talking about the making the link from neuroscience to education, I think a lot of the conversation that just took place is very unrealistic, and that there's another way to think about it that I think could be more productive. Anything that you do in the lab, anything that you do, that establishes the basic science, is establishing the basic science. Forget the concept that it's going to directly impact schools. It simply will not. And if it will, the impact could be negative as well as positive. When things actually impact on schools, they have been formed into something designed to be impactful for schools, and then they have been evaluated in schools and found to be effective, ideally in randomized control trials. Actually, Guinevere was talking about this. This is the thing that we keep, people keep trying to skip that step. And if you skip that step, disaster will ensue. And with a colleague, I did a review of research on technology strategies intended to improve reading, and another one on technology strategies intended to improve reading for struggling readers, and another one on math. And in all of these, the evidence base is that these technology programs are not making much difference, if any at all, for improving outcomes. Yet they were all based on very good theory. They made a lot of sense. There's nothing wrong with the science. In fact, there's hardly any program that you could imagine that doesn't have a good theoretical base somewhere, that doesn't have some lab studies that support that kind of intervention. And yet, until you formed it into something that can be evaluated, has been evaluated, replicated, then at that point, then you have something that you're ready to talk to the schools about, and that you can have some confidence in. Until then, you're giving us your opinion the same way anybody else gives their opinion about how this lab thing, or you put some people into got fMRI studies, could be beneficial to national policy. Your guess is as good as anyone's, and absolutely should not be presented as any better as anyone else's.
Nobody disagrees with that.
Comments?
Well, nobody disagrees with that, I don't think. I mean, I don't think any of us think that anything should be directly imported into a classroom without doing, but we have a trouble, as Jay Geed was saying, getting cooperation to scale up and do some of the things in the large universe of public education. And then we have the problem of generalization. If we go do it in private schools, people justifiably say to us, well, that sample doesn't really map very well onto a good representative sample. But I also want to bring up, though, Bob, the cohort effect. When I talk about premature education, we have a cohort effect that we can look at, for example, everybody's concerned about the burgeoning diagnosis of ADHD. I am too. Even though the federal government has been very nice, given me lots of money to study it over the years, it doesn't mean I want it to proliferate beyond its meaningful boundaries. And a lot of the effect seems to be that, you know, the diagnosis is made on inappropriate for age expectations, but that becomes for grade expectations. So we have a cohort effect kind of research, which is we get a burgeoning diagnostic category, and I think it's going to happen with LD, also learning disabilities. If you keep asking people to do things that they are not neurobiologically ready on average to do, you're going to get an increase in pathologizing children. So I think that is a kind of research that I think is capable of being done. I don't think anyone's done it, but I would just submit that this is my, having 40 years perspective, that this is what I've seen, that we have had some unfortunate guinea pig experiments of just arbitrarily doing things like saying, you know, we're going to do things a year earlier. And I am terrified about this universal pre-K unless they all get Dr. Petito to come and tell them to do bilingual and music education and don't do pre-literate. I hate the name preschool. Why does it have to be preschool? Why don't we have, and not to mention the utility of play in human development, that's an even more huge global subject. But if we could just say we need to have bilingual education for everybody, that everybody needs another language, and everybody should be studying music. We have lots of effects that are beneficial on the brain of music training as well.
Other people on the panel?
Other questions?
Yes, please.
That's actually a good segue into my question. I'm Bill O'Brien from the National Endowment for the Arts, and there's been two convenings and summits that sort of touched upon what you were just talking about in the last couple of weeks. One was a brain health summit that looked at the challenge of thinking about how learners can be taught to think rather than just be taught to test. And then I think it was about a week ago, the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Forum had a panel that I helped moderate that was on science, technology plus arts, and thinking about how that connects to what a lot of people are concerned about in terms of future workforce competencies. So some of the issues that came up in both of those talked about these very pragmatic and practical concerns that people have for invigorating future economies, et cetera. And how to think about the kinds of skills that are necessary that include STEM, but also include things like critical thinking, creativity, imagination. I know Johns Hopkins, that's well represented here, was very active in a Dana Consortium thing in 2008. I know Loran was part of that looked at learning arts and the brain. And I'm just wondering whether it's specifically about the arts or not, but what is the broader knowledge on neuroscience, the working knowledge that might be emerging now that could help inform policy on issues related to imagination, critical thinking, collaboration, empathy, those kinds of things that keep coming up in these kinds of conversations?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we had, I was involved in the Dana Foundation's grant that asked questions about whether aspects of training in the arts, defined broadly performance arts, visual arts, musical art, and whether that is an isolated massaging of brain capacities, or does training in those areas spill over and impact children's ability to learn things that are non-art? Does it ramp up their capacity in doing any complex cognitive analytical thinking? Does the pressures that they have to meet to process complex patterns in music in any way spill over into facilitating their acquisition of math or language? This was a huge grant. I wrote this grant with Michael Gazzaniga and Kevin Dunbar, and both interested in higher cognition and critical thinking and setting context. What are the contexts that we need to set the context to facilitate the kinds of birth of creativity? And across the center grant, basically it was a center grant, we all did individual studies, and collectively the answer was, and just to summarize 10 labs, looking at different domains. I did dance, and it's the impact of knowledge in dance. Is it just facilitated kinesthetic body movement information or movement sequences, or to what extent does the knowledge that you gain from movement sequences impact language acquisition, learning a new language? And broadly across all these labs, if you read the report, the final conclusion was that education in the arts was vital, essential to human brain development, that it was not an encapsulated benefit, that the facilitative knowledge that someone gets within the domain of that specific art training has very dramatic impact on higher cognitive functions and analytical reasoning and relational thought that goes well beyond just the domain. So the impact of the study was very it really brought pause to us, because all around us was school systems that were in a pinch, money, financial, and the first thing they were cutting were the arts. And we were finding that training in the arts its benefit went way out of the boundaries of the specific art into computational processes and cognitive analyses that went well into their ability to learn geography and math and science, etc., the traditional topics that we hold so near and dear to our hearts. So the impact on these children was very broad. And so if you do want to set the stage for a creative city, a creative neighborhood, a creative future, creativity in the 21st century to come, what the brain science taught us in this, Gazzaniga, Dunbar, Petito consortium, was that we need to reserve and retain those classical training because it was having far-reaching benefits than we ever believed, well outside of the domain of the individual art. So it had, we published a monograph. It sits on my website. Is it been utilized? Where did it go? With regard to the former question, I think your name was Bob, I agreed with you totally. When I look at the landscape, the ball doesn't get dropped with the scientists thinking that their studies have to be replicated, and efficacy studies have to ensue, and schools must be involved, and proper science has to be done. It's really, once that is done, where is the gap to facilitate the communication to policymakers who are making decisions at the state level, as Brett was, at the standards level? How do we go? Where's that bridge?
Yeah, I think that along with, I'm glad you mentioned dance, because along with the cuts in the arts and stuff, are also physical education. Programs are getting cut as well. And at a creativity conference, talking to a wealthy entrepreneur, he was saying just 10 years ago he was looking for people out of business school who could tell him the price of the top 40 stocks of the ticker after the morning. And he said, that's worthless now. Anybody in this room with a smartphone can do the exact same thing. So memorizing facts and figures is not the future. That's not where it's at. And so what do you need to do? You need to search through this ocean of information, find the gems, search signals or noise, find patterns, all these things that the arts and stuff help you get better at. But it's almost an afterthought. So we know that this is the future. We know what the skills are going to be needed, but we seem to not be acting upon it. in terms of the whole, facts and figures. That's not what, our brains need to be doing in the future. So how do we use these technologies to actually move us beyond where we are instead of just replace these skills? So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges in terms of like how creativity, people sometimes think is like magic. Either you're born with it or you're not. And that's not true. You can do a lot, to increase creativity in your life and the lives of your children. So I think that I don't know how to better advocate, for the arts in terms of that it's not a matter of the arts or academics, that they're inseparable and synergistic. But it sort of seems to be on the chopping block whenever there are things to be cut. They're the first to go.
Okay, a third thing, in terms of just general learning theory, there's also the question of reward systems, and we have a lot of children for whom having none of the arts as part of school means that the rewarding part of going to school has been chopped out. So aside from these, which I don't disagree with at all, by the way, there's a lot of evidence that makes a linkage as follows. Movement and learning movement patterns is important as a neurodevelopmental substrate for conceptualizing and representing three-dimensional space. As a matter of fact, when we conceptualize three-dimensional spatial rotation in the brain, we do it in real time as though we were moving. And this in turn is very important in many aspects of math and science, and therefore there is a sort of neurodevelopmental linkage there. Whether it be sports or any bodily movement in space it's just as fundamental to spatial representation as whatever it is. And I no longer will say as hearing is to speech, but as some kind of patterned input is to language. Let's put it that way.
And just somewhat following up on that as well, though, are video games an art? Should they be included as the arts in terms of playing video games as opposed to the cello or the violin? Is there evidence that one is sort of brain better than the other?
Using as many muscles, you're not moving and no.
Oh, some of the games you can.
No, but you're not. You just don't have that three-dimensional. Even on a musical instrument, you have a dimensionality of using two hands across. It's just very different.
I think one area where people have done research on this, looking at the effect of video games, and Daphne Beverly has done some very nice work showing that you do enhance some aspects of attention, particularly in the peripheral field during those kinds of games. And it goes back to what we discussed earlier, which is the technology, Bob Slavin's comment about what actually works in the classroom as opposed to in the laboratory setting. And I think your point really, Bob, was in part the sort of maybe still this rift between what we theoretically think is possible and what in reality has to happen in the classroom setting. And I think that it is a good point, and it's also encapsulated by comments when we talk about brain imaging research, and a teacher says, "Okay, so what do I do on Monday morning in the classroom? How does it change what I do?" And I think this is why I really wanted to make the point about the fact that it has to go hand in hand and it has to be reciprocal. And so I think, validating through these large-scale randomized controlled studies what works in the classroom can be made even more robust and be more informed if we understand the neural systems that are involved in this. And I think that is where we can make a contribution. And we talked about technology, but another example that comes to mind is going back to this idea that actually Dr. Denkler brought up this morning, is what predicts success. And the question is, why is the rapid automatized naming test not mandatory for every child entering into schools? Because it predicts with high reliance, where that child was likely to fall in terms of whether they're going to be a successful reader or not. Why don't we just give it in schools, and then we have some insights into how these children may do. In China, a strong predictor of your reading success is how good you are at copying Chinese characters, and the motor component which also was brought up by you earlier, is an important aspect of that when you're copying Chinese characters. And so Chuck Buffetti and Li Haitan and others have showed that that's a strong predictor, just like rapid naming is in the alphabetic system, along with phonemic awareness and those kinds of things. One thing that Chuck Buffetti has shown is that when people who learn second language Chinese do it by a process that involves using hand movement and copying characters, the neural signature for character reading in Chinese is somewhat different than if you don't use that kind of method of learning Chinese. And so what that illustrates is that you can do sort of lab research of real life situations of learning, whether it's learning as an elementary student or learning, say, as a college student, that sort of illustrates why it may be that different kinds of approaches to learning, whether it's a language or whether it's math, can be kind of be further, more carefully investigated in terms of the neural systems that are taking place. And I think that is interesting to recognize that maybe different approaches are going to lead to a different brain system that's being invoked. And to be honest, I think teachers also like to know. I think what neuroscience is providing is in some ways a sort of a validation of their technique. So of course, I agree that the randomized controlled studies is really the proof. Does this work, and is this the most effective way to go about it? But understanding the mechanisms that are at play to bring about those changes is something that fascinates not just us, but also the teachers, and adds robustness to the approach.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Dorothy Jones-Davis. I'm a AAAS policy fellow here. And my question kind of comes from a lot of the things that we've learned as fellows. So we've learned a couple of things. One is that science communication is key with the public, not just with amongst scientists and at scientific conferences. And then the second part of what I want to get in terms of my question is sort of the idea that you can influence policy both from top down and bottom up, and that bottom up strategies are sometimes even more effective than top down. So certainly, well, it would be amazing to have Arnie Duncan in the room right now so we could, give him a little tongue lashing about what the importance of neuroscience informing education might be. There's certainly a role for us coming from the bottom up and having sort of community understanding what the importance and what we know about neuroscience. So in a very informed way, things that have been validated. There are plenty of things, you've highlighted many of them, that have been validated in study after study in different situations and different cohorts that we know work. And still they're not getting in. And so I'm also speaking with my cap on as a parent of a 5-year-old little girl who's learning how to read and starting the early reading process, and looking at her as she develops and having a neuroscience cap and sort of seeing how, being aware of what processes may be going on in her brain as she's learning. So I'm just wondering, what is the role for parents and other sort of community advocates and those that are inside the classroom? I know, for example, when I've talked to my daughter's preschool, and I also don't really like that name, about some of the things that I know about neuroscience, they're actually hungry and excited to hear what's going on. So in the classrooms, teachers do very important work, and certainly nobody on the panel would say otherwise, but a lot of them are really eager to implement things that do work because they see firsthand, cohort after cohort, how kids are different and how they learn differently, and they don't like to see their kids struggle in the classroom and be frustrated by the unfair things that they're being given at the wrong time. So they really want, I think Guinevere just said, they want to have data that backs up that what they're seeing in the classroom. So how do we do that more effectively? Is there a way or role for sort of parents and people on the ground? Is there some sort of toolkit that can be developed to be better at communicating what the research has shown? So I'm just curious if anyone has any ideas or knows of societies that might be interested in this. This might be a future fellow project, I don't know, but I just think that this might be another way to influence policy.
One thing I do is I go around inviting myself to talk to parent-teacher organizations all the time. I'll just go anywhere and talk to in any evening to anybody who wants to have me. And I've also been teaching teachers for the past 5 years in a master's program. But I think really and truly, my point is also not only are you a parent, but you're a voter. And to me, it's very important that you can really have an impact on policy if you can incorporate some of these principles, like the fact that we shouldn't be cutting all the arts out of our education because there is real evidence of its benefit. And I would add the benefit in terms of learning theory, that it's rewarding. It's a rewarding experience to go to school and have, just in a general frame of reference of, there has to be positivity about school. So, I think, just invite people to meet with parents who are those who like to communicate in as simple terms as possible.
I completely agree with you that the parents and the teachers are hungry for the information. I've never had a situation where they rejected the information. They're excited, smart, interested, understand how it applies to the development of children and their own children. To attempt to start that bottom-up information, I think you heard that I was in the National Science Foundation's Center for the Science of Learning at Gallaudet. And we've developed several mechanisms to try to communicate the research findings that are enduring, those that really require that we have a change of mind, that there's a timely revolution in our thinking. And we've tried the typical range, the webinars, the research briefs that take science and make them very accessible. We have tweets, and we have social media and fancy web pages, and we're still searching for the magical bridge that affects change. And maybe, as you said, Dr. Denkel, the fact that you can vote, to require that your politicians have fundamental information, that they be knowledgeable of the types of things that you're knowledgeable about, and if not, demand why. I do think that it requires very high up involvement. I think it requires sharing the information with the president, sharing the information with Arnie Duncan, sharing the information so it's heard, gaining access, having these people interact at a level that is meaningful and where they're listening. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex Tinker. I work in Dr. Geed's lab. As an undergraduate student, I attended NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. And I was able to design a concentration in neuroscience and art. So I guess we've made art a topic now. And so I was able to complete the coursework of a neuroscience major, but at the same time still focus on my interest in artwork. And the control that I had over my study program really made me realize how our education program, especially up until college, is not student-centric. We don't give our students a choice of how they want to study, how they want to learn. And I'm wondering, and I guess this is going to be touched on all day long, how we can use neuroscience to show that our brains are capable of deciding how we want to learn.
So I'm not sure if I have an exact answer for you, but I think one thing that I just observed before you came up and asked the question that you did is that we've been talking about teachers and parents, but we haven't been talking quite so much about students. And one thing that I observed a few weeks ago by going to a private school that specializes in children with learning differences is that these elementary students were learning about their brain and what the different areas of the brain do. And it's something that I saw in the classroom that I see in the laboratory, but of course in our case it's very restricted, which is that when you teach children about their brain, just like teachers, it gets them very excited, and it begins to give them a framework by which to understand perhaps why they have some areas where they have limitations and other areas where they have strength. And I think teaching neuroscience early on at an appropriate level is an important aspect of this process. So it's not just bringing the bringing it to the parents, as we talked about earlier on, but I think also early on involving students as part of that process, and getting back to this idea that there is a range of skills and a range of strengths and weaknesses, and having a mechanism by which to map them onto an appropriate understanding of what the brain and how the brain works is critical to all of that. And it's interesting that these things have been very much advocated by schools that specialize in children that have learning differences, but I think can be generalized to all students.
And just briefly, too, neuroscience does have insights into this with regard to, as Dr. Denkel said, reward systems, motivational systems, the impact of increased reward and motivation on the endurance of memory, the transference of working memory, short-term memory to long-term memory, that emotional impact and motivation certainly influence the duration and longevity of memory. So, but still, these are isolated facts that aren't integrated in a meaningful way that can be then used to change a school system, or to change a view that students benefit from sculpting and contributing to the types of things they learn and how they learn.
So we'll have time for 2 more questions, so the people standing. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Phyllis Klein, and I direct Fab Lab DC, which is part of a community outreach project that started at MIT. We're essentially we live more in the informal learning environment. We're part of a network that's all over the world. We deal with lifelong learners. We deal a lot with both young people, K through 12, but you're all welcome to come to the lab. It's essentially an opportunity to explore self-directed, project-based learning, where you come maybe without an idea, but you might come up with an idea while you're there. Maybe you come with a specific idea which lives in the realm of our technology. We have digital fabrication equipment. We essentially serve as a hub, a creative hub for people to gather. And through our network, we've seen anecdotally the effect that this type of learning has on people, and we're being approached every day. In fact, inundated, we're working with Gallaudet now to incorporate this into mainstream education, where this can be a place where a school adds as another resource, much like the gym or the art studio, where students can come, they can delve into self-directed learning. Students teach one another, but it's not just about the students teaching, or it's sort of a distributed learning where we all come to learn together. The teacher won't have all the answers. My question is, I'm so happy to be here today and to learn about your work and now have access to it. I wonder if places like the Fab Labs might also be research places for you all to consider looking at this type of learning, how it applies to your fields in neuroscience and education. The policymakers are interested in this. Tom Khalil will speak about that later, perhaps. But I just wanted to say, having a repository for we lay people to access your information, and also, as Dorothy was saying, from the ground up, because we're parents, we're teachers, we're students, we're artists, designers, thinkers, please consider using us as a research opportunity for your work.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you.
adding that resource. And then last.
Hi, my name is Juliana Paray-Blagoyev. I'm at George Washington University, and I have a dual background in imaging studies and doing the kind of R&D work in classrooms that I know is so hard and important to do. I have about 18 questions. I'm picking the shortest one. Dr. Eden, you mentioned the Heft paper that showed that there are studies that can demonstrate that there are neural correlates that predict future reading outcomes better than any behavioral ones. I'm wondering, when I saw that paper, I thought, oh, now there's something that should have big ripples. but I wasn't in the imaging field any longer at that time. I'm curious, have you seen big ripples? Are there people who are looking at that and saying, oh, this should change the way that we fund some portions of neuroimaging studies? Are you seeing papers come out that try to target understanding which neural regions can better predict important educational outcomes than behavioral studies, and then tracking back and using those neural correlates to better define behavioral markers, because we can't stick everybody in a scanner?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question, because I particularly put that study in because I think it's an example of where we're seeing sort of a pivotal change, perhaps, where it seems that the neural correlate has better predictive powers than behavior. That doesn't mean we can put in place MRI machines at every school and so on and so forth, but I think it certainly is an important piece, and it's certainly, you were asking about ripples, I think it's certainly stimulated the research community to investigate this further. There are several studies ongoing. There are also, one thing that's sort of surprising is we don't have longitudinal fMRI studies of children with dyslexia. There are some in the works, but you'd be surprised if you look for publications. You won't find many at this time, it seems like you're aware. It's difficult work to do. It's expensive work to do. 10 years ago, people would have said, well, why would you do something like this? It's so expensive. Why don't you just do a very careful behavioral evaluation to try and get the same information? But that's changed a little bit. It's become cheaper, and behavioral evaluations aren't that cheap either. So these have become a little more equal. I think it's certainly stimulated, to answer your question directly, it's certainly stimulated a lot of interest, and I think more research. And it gets back to the one other issue that's important, and that is that many of these studies are done in groups, and we have to, as you know, study large number of subjects in order to get the statistical power that we need. And now we're sort of here as well transitioning to kind of this idea of being able to do individual evaluations. And of course the study was done in a group, and what you saw up there was an analysis that involved a group. Does that mean I can take your child and predict based on a single subject response? That certainly is the hope, and people are using algorithms to identify, can you take a particular scan and apply it to an already trained algorithm that has been learned through looking at data from students of different levels of reading to tell you something later on, to tell you something about the predictive powers. It's not there yet, but it's certainly something that seems too enticing to ignore, and I think people are studying it. How it actually translates into practicalities, I think, is still open and yet to be seen.
So with that, I'd like to close and thank the panel and the audience for great questions. And just a note for the hashtag NeuroEDU questions, we'll try to answer those offline as well. But thanks again.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you for being with us for this first panel. As you know, now is a lunch break. Please be back here before 1 p.m. I'm very excited about our keynote talk. I hope you are too. I hope you can come back. Lunch is on your own. Remember, no food or drink in the auditorium, but we do invite you back to the second floor to one of the other breakout rooms to enjoy your lunch with friends. Thank you.